But no, according to Exeter's website, and from my own experiences, these white squirrels are not albino. They are a rare genetic mutation of the black and gray squirrel, and they do have black eyes, not red. They have become the symbol of the small town of Exeter. This small town has and always will be a huge part of my identity. My mom was from Exeter, and so were her parents. I went to the same public school and high school as my mom. We even had the same third grade teacher, Miss Brown. There are many perks to growing up in a small town, such as my friends were always a bike ride away, or we knew all of our neighbors so that there was this constant feeling of safety, and we never locked our doors. I grew a great sense of community as everyone knew everyone. If there was someone in trouble, the town would band together and help. If a club needed money, the entire town would fundraise. Or if a sports team was going into a tournament, the entire community would show their support and celebrate their victories. Being part of a community is a super important part of my identity. I always feel the need to be involved and participate in community events. I was part of Girl Guides, I played for the local hockey team and the baseball team. I was in band in high school, which would play at community events. And when I become a teacher, being a part of a school community will be just as important. I understand that my small role inside a larger community impacts the lives of everybody. In the small town of Exeter, I played many roles, and as a teacher in a school community, I will be able to play the roles of an educator and impact the lives of so many individuals. Moving forward on the topic of white squirrels, I like to think of these squirrels as a metaphor for the people who live in Exeter. Hear me out. The human squirrel population of Exeter are predominantly white. The families have been around since the 1900s. Some try to leave the town, but always end right back in Exeter. And they're always busy doing the same thing year after year. They have a very repetitive lifestyle. These factors play a huge role in my identity, and let me explain this further. Growing up, I was surrounded by predominantly white people. Almost all of my friends were white. I was rarely exposed to different religions, cultures, food, people, or ethnicities for a lot of my youth. At the time, I was unaware of how this formed my identity, but reflecting on it now, I can see that it made me a very sheltered and naive child. But it also gave me this urge to want to break free and learn more. I was lucky enough to be able to leave the town and go to the University of Ottawa and receive a degree in sociology. I have taken a lot of time to learn about the different cultures around the world. And I think living in a small town is the main reason for this constant urge to travel and learn more. I will discuss it further with my next artifacts. My next artifacts are my travel journals, and these journals are my pride and joy. After high school, like I said, I felt like I needed to do and learn more. I felt like I didn't truly know who I was and what I was supposed to do with my life. Then in my first year sociology course, I was hit with a tsunami of basic information that most people would say that you should have known. But I was, like I said, I was so naive and sheltered to know it or believe it. I remember my very first lecture, my professor told me how the infrastructure in cities like New York City were a form of racism. And I thought about this for a long time, and I was like, why, how can cement buildings and bridges be racist? But then he went on to explain how in areas close to beaches, the architecture would build bridges that were just low enough that buses couldn't fit under them. And this was because white people would have cars to drive to the beach, but the majority of black people had to take public transportation, which wouldn't fit under the bridges. I was shocked. Then, lecture after lecture, I would learn more and more information about our world and our society. And then finally one day, I learned about residential schools. And in my 18 years of Canadian education, I was furious that I had no idea what my white settler ancestors were a part of. After my first year of university, I became so critical of my upbringing, my privilege, and my identity. I swore to myself that I am going to do anything in my power to become knowledgeable about the world around me. I wanted to burst the small bubble that I had been in for so long. And for me, in order to fulfill this, I had to travel and learn, and that is exactly what I have been doing. My first trip was to Western Australia, where my sister was going to university for a semester. I was only there for 10 days, but in that short period of time, I was shocked to find out that the systemic racism that happens in Canada with Indigenous populations also happens across the world. It was the first trip I began to make global connections and realize I am a part of a global society, and it is something much bigger than me. Unfortunately, I didn't write a journal for this trip, but I had learned it was a must in order to self-reflect on what I had learned. Since my first trip to another country, I've been to Thailand, Indonesia, Portugal, Greece, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. Each country has its unique culture, as well as people, food, laws, economy, landscapes, and so much more. Immersing oneself into another culture, I believe, is the best way to learn. I know that I could talk for hours and hours on each destination, and I get so excited when I get asked to talk about it. But instead, I've decided to select a few lessons from my journals and discuss what I learned, how it impacted my identity, and how I will use it as a future teacher. First, I'm going to talk about my trip to Thailand. A lesson I learned here was on the global connection that we've always had. In school, I was taught what Canadians, specifically white soldiers, accomplished in World War II, in places like Germany and around Europe. However, I was unaware that World War II in its entirety was a very global war, until I went to River Quay to the War Memorial Bridge. Here I learned that when the Japanese had occupied this part of Thailand, there were many prisoners of war, and this included people from Thailand, Canadian people, and people from Australia or America. And it was slave labor, and the conditions were terrible, and they were building a bridge to advance the Japanese. At one point, when the bridge was almost finished, the prisoners banded together and blew it up to slow the Japanese from advancing. When reflecting on this story, I believe part of my identity is to be a critical thinker. I have learned that there is a strong relationship between the cycle of knowledge and power. Many of the textbooks I've learned from growing up were from a white male perspective and usually with a hero aspect to it. There was not much about the global history and how Canada impacted the entire global society. There is so much beyond the textbooks used in a classroom, and I hope that in the future I can teach my students to be critical of the knowledge that they are provided and understand that there's so much more to learn. Second, I've chosen to discuss my trip to Greece. I would definitely describe myself as a doer. I learned by doing and experiencing things firsthand to fully comprehend the subject. I've been taught some Greek mythology in high school, but everything just seemed like a fantasy and unrealistic. It was not until I went to Athens and firsthand saw the Acropolis and things like the Olympic Stadium and actual artifacts and these statues and buildings, then did I really realize that the truth behind it all. It took me weeks to comprehend something that seemed so fake was so real and it's been around for so long. And I can kind of compare that to dinosaurs, and the idea of a dinosaur, I knew that they existed, but a huge animal that ate others, or a T-Rex and flying dinosaurs even existed. And then when you go to a museum and you see the things firsthand, it's easier to comprehend something that seems so abstract. And for me, that is how I learn best. And I really want to implement as much hands-on experiences as possible when I become a teacher. Finally, I have my journal from my trip to South America, which was the most meaningful and life-changing experience. I'm specifically going to talk about the first 7 weeks in Brazil. I volunteered at a center for individuals with learning disabilities, including autism and Down syndrome. I lived with the family that I worked for. My main takeaway from the entire experience that I will always remember is the culture and behaviors of Brazilian people. Almost every person I encountered were the friendliest, selfless people I know. There was such a community feel between all of the locals. I stayed with a woman named Gloria, her husband Fernando, and their 2 daughters, Gloria and Glacy. Gloria's father is an American who came to Brazil to preach. Him and his Brazilian wife adopted over 50 children, many of whom have disabilities. Gloria and her husband started the center Angel de Guarda, or in English, Guardian Angel, to give back to their community. Many of Gloria's adopted siblings help out at the center as well, and a lot of it is volunteer work. Some example of the selfless and community feel that I experienced include the time that Gloria, myself, and her daughter were on a crowded bus. There was a woman sitting who took Gloria's daughter and held her with no questions asked. It was just normal to help out other mothers. Another time I was sitting having lunch alone at the beach, and there was a visible homeless man who was bothering me. And keep in mind, my Portuguese is not strong, and there were not many Brazilians that spoke English in the area that I stayed. Despite this, an elderly man went out of his way to get the restaurant manager and who got the homeless man to leave me alone because I wasn't able to express this myself. Another time we were out for dinner and the table next to us were having a birthday party and birthday cake. My host's 4-year-old daughter, Gloria, was singing along to their happy birthday song. When the other table noticed, they gave her a slice of cake. And I could tell 100 similar stories to this, displaying this community feel. I would write daily in my journal the amazing stories and experiences, and then I would reflect on how I can bring this culture back with me. It takes nothing to be kind to people or to make somebody's day, and that is exactly what Brazilian people do. I swore to myself to be more selfless and take time to make someone's day. I know that being a teacher, I will impact many lives of my students. I want my students to feel as though I would do anything for them, but I also want to teach them that they too can help others in their school and classroom. When I started this assignment, I really had no idea the reasoning as to why I described or saw myself the way I do. However, once I investigated deep into parts of my life, I can describe my identity and why I see myself this way. In summary, my lack of knowledge about my ancestors and their history is part of my identity. I have had to fill the gaps with history textbook lessons, which ultimately has led me to believe that being a colonialist is part of my identity. Moving forward, I must understand my privilege. I must have an open mind and heart as an educator, and knowing my positioning in history and make an effort to move forward in a positive direction. Next, part of my identity is my sense of community. I am a small part in a large group of people. I long to be a part of a school community in the future, and I want my students to feel the same community feel. I understand the importance to be a part of a group and to have their support. Also, part of my identity is being from a small town, and this entails growing up sheltered and naive. However, it has led me to my favorite part of my identity as a learner and a traveler. From traveling across the world, I've learned so much about myself, culture, and the world around me. I have an open mind and a constant desire to learn more. As an educator in the future, I want to learn from my students just as much as they learn from me. I cannot wait to share myself, my knowledge, and my identity with my students.